This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Perfect Victims in the Politics of Appeal by Mohammed El-Kurd. Palestine is a microcosm of the world, on fire, stubborn, fragmented, dignified. While a settler colonial state continues to inflict devastating violence, fundamental truths are deliberately obscured. The perpetrators are coddled, while the victims are blamed and placed on trial. Why must Palestinians prove their humanity? And what are the implications of such an infuriatingly impossible task? With fearless prose and lyrical precision, Mohammed El-Kurd refuses a life spent in cross-examination. Rather than asking the oppressed to perform a perfect victimhood, El-Kurd asks friends and foes alike to look Palestinians in the eye, foregoing both deference and condemnation. Find Perfect Victims at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. The crises engulfing the capitalist world system are manifold and massive. Climate change and the geoeconomic flight to control the nodes of an emerging clean energy economy. A liberal international order shredded to pieces by Biden's full-throttled support for Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. The war in Ukraine and Trump's pivot toward Putin and the resulting evisceration of the Atlanticist alliance. The resulting European push for a defense and infrastructure buildup and the likely jettisoning of the debt rules that a decade ago crushed Southern European economies alongside the region's left-wing political movements. This on a continent where the far right is on the rise everywhere. Trump's tariff wars across the hemisphere and the world, and his militaristic threats against Gaza, Panama, Greenland, and Canada. All of it wrapped up in the new Cold War with a rising China that's seeking new opportunities for alliance amid the wreckage of Trump's rampage. All of this and so much more, including where do the poor, post-colonial countries of the global South fit into this all? I'm having this massive discussion as a two-part series with Ilias Alami and Tim Sahay. Before we get started, this podcast is a labor of love. Love for the struggle against colonialism, capitalism, all forms of oppression. And for my purposes here, I want to emphasize labor because I do this as my full-time job. And many people do it as their part-time job. And the reason everyone can get paid to work on The Dig is because listeners like you support the podcast at patreon.com/thedig. We also have books, tote bags, coffee mugs to send particularly generous listeners in the U.S. Particularly generous listeners elsewhere get ebooks. We don't paywall anything because we want everyone possible to listen to this analysis. Ruthlessly analyzing everything so that we can change everything is more urgent than ever. And we really do want everyone to listen. That only works because those of you who can afford to pitch in, do so. Contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. And then just one quick announcement. The Daniel Singer Millennium Prize Foundation is offering a $10,000 prize for a published article from 2024 addressing the popularity of right-wing movements among working-class people. Nominations are due April 1st and take 5 minutes to complete. Self-nominations are welcome, and you can make a nomination by going to danielsingerprize.org. Okay, here's Ilias Alami and Tim Sahay. Ilias Alami is a professor in political economy at the University of Cambridge and a research associate at the Second Cold War Observatory. He's the author of Money, Power, and Financial Capital in Emerging Markets, and the co-author, with Adam Dixon, of The Specter of State Capitalism, which is free to download. Tim Sahay is the co-editor with Kate McKinsey of The Polycrisis, a publication at Phenomenal World that focuses on the political economy of climate with an emphasis on the global South. He's also the co-director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. At the lab, he advises governments from Lula's Brazil to Claudia Sheinbaum's Mexico on finding their slice of jobs, profits, and investments in the highly contested global green economy. This episode is the first in a two-part series. Here we go. Ilias Alami and Tim Sahay, welcome to The Dig. And Tim, welcome back.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to be here, Dan. Very excited about this discussion.
I want to begin this conversation by discussing what we're seeing in a more general sense taking shape right now. And then we're going to get into a lot of specifics. But to start off, discussing this complex, crisis-ridden geopolitical and geoeconomic order, a global order that is in turn destabilizing domestic politics, which is in turn further destabilizing the global order, and so on and so on. In the U.S., Trump is seeking to radically reshape, maybe shatter NATO. The entire Western alliance is on the ropes as he moves toward a settlement with Putin on Putin's terms for Ukraine. Tariffs are being imposed or threatened on countries all over the world. He's threatened to seize Gaza and ethnically cleanse it into a seaside resort, and to seize the Panama Canal, Greenland, and the entirety of Canada. Just to set the table for the discussion more generally, how should we make sense of the order, the world order, as it was when Trump came into office, and then what Trump is doing now and where it all might be heading?
That's a great way to frame the conversation. And I think there's a few things to say here. One would be that a lot of what we're seeing happen under Trump 2.0 is perhaps an acceleration of trends that were already at play. And there's a few trends that we can discuss today: the rise of what we can call a new state capitalism, the emergence of a new form of geopolitics that we can call the geopolitics of connectivity, a second Cold War, which are all terms I think we'll discuss today. But I see, Trump in all of its erratic behavior and unpredictability, and his use of bullying as a mode of power, as Adam Tooze puts it, as a set of behaviors which are deeply embedded in those long historical processes. And so there is, despite the erratic character and unpredictability of all that, there is a certain logic, which is simply a reflection of the fact that his behavior and Trump 2.0 is embedded in those structural trends.
Yeah, I mean, it's really all very good to speak of structural trends, and we kind of know what the big picture is. Like, the left in general has been talking about all these themes of extreme oligarchy in the United States, a fight between 1% and 99%. The rise of Asia and China as being truly world historical trends that haven't been seen for over 500 years. The rise of the rest versus the West, a more sort of diffusion of state power and wealth out of the transatlantic Western core, and the undermining of that state power and wealth from that transatlantic core thanks to the self-inflicted sort of financial crisis from 2008, from which, all of our lives have been affected in the shadow of that crash. You had a long wave of sort of stagnation in the West in the 2010s, high period of unemployment, sluggish investment, high inequality, the American dream or the European dream out of the hands of so many millions of us who couldn't afford to buy a house or get a job or get married or have kids. So, there's a lot of how that sort of world historical crisis of 2008 has just sort of shattered that peaceful liberal order that some like to imagine that existed before 2008. And therefore, when somebody like Ilias sort of says that this is just a continuation of trends, just accelerating, I'm very tempted to buy that. But at the same time, there is a level of an agency here in the hands of Trump 1, Biden 1, and now Trump 2, which is a deliberate kind of revisionism of that order, saying that not only is this not good for the vast majority of Americans, like this is not really good for American elites either. And so we are sort of hell-bent on revising that order, challenging the rise of China and trying to do interventions in strategic sectors to improve our own state power and wealth. And so you might just call this like a strong period of neo-mercantilism, which is the title of a wonderful book by Eric Helena that I encourage listeners to read, which is all states are continually engaged in this project of what does it take to increase our state power and wealth. And the way American elites are sort of going about this business is disruptive to the prior order, but you can see that they're engaged in some kind of a conscious, active project.
Well, I mean, on that, I agree with a lot of what Tim said. I think, what I wanted to emphasize is that there is a form of logic to what Trump 2.0 is. But that said, this is not to say that Bidenomics, Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 are the same thing and the same set of reactions to the kind of trends that you've mentioned, Tim, that I've mentioned earlier. So it's also important, as you said, to recognize the open-endedness of some of the decisions which are made. And yeah, there are strong, similarities and common things across Trump 1.0, Bidenomics, and then Trump 2.0. But there's also things which are different, and both things matter, the similar stuff and things that are changing rapidly.
What's the nature of the crisis? Tim, you dated it back to the 2008 economic crisis, and you, alongside Kate McKenzie, are the editor of The Polycrisis, a project of this really wonderful political economic analysis website called Phenomenal World that people should be reading if they're not already. Polycrisis, what does it mean, and why is it a useful heuristic to make sense of the world we're experiencing right now?
I think what makes it interesting is that it tries to identify some of these sort of big mega trends that we are thinking about, but really emphasizing their overlapping nature and their interacting nature and their sort of newness in the way that those interactions are increasing. And specifically, we're looking at this crisis of the world order that we're facing is an interacting crisis of ecology. It's a devastating ecological crisis, whether it's water, whether it's drought, whether it's the accelerating effects of habitat destruction and climate change. So that's an ecological crisis that is absolutely unique in our epoch as a species, as Homo sapiens on this planet for 200,000 years. Then there is a very sort of shorter sort of time scale of economic crises. And you could date that to that 2008 crisis that I talked about. You could date that to the high unemployment rates in most of the world after the 2020 Corona crisis. And then there is this sort of, so there's ecology, there's economics, and then there's a crisis of empire, right? Like this is a world order that is creating a lot of wars, a lot of new security conflicts between states. We've seen a terrifying increase in just wars, the highest number of wars since the end of the Cold War. So you basically have these three ecological, economic, and imperial sort of crises interacting with each other. And so our goal with the Polycrisis project was to really examine them together and to sort of break some intellectual and sort of political silos that we have, where, different sets of people pay attention and a lot of attention to one of those silos, but don't necessarily think about the interacting and sort of metastasizing nature of this crisis.
Yeah, I think, I have a lot of time and sympathy for the notion of polycrisis, especially as articulated by Adam Tooze and Tim and, your co-authors and colleagues, Kate and others at the Polycrisis Project. And particularly because, indeed, if we accept the hypothesis that we are at some sort of historical inflection point, then we do need tools to help us figure how we got there and what's the specificity of the present moment. And from that perspective, I think the polycrisis concept or notion is very helpful for that. So, you could say the proof of the polycrisis is in the pudding, and the pudding's pretty good. So I like that. But that said, I also sympathize quite a bit with, what you could call a post-colonial critique of the polycrisis and the Marxian critique of it. So the first one would say that, well, yeah, fine. I mean, it's true that it seems that we are at this unique moment with a remarkable confluence of all of those crises. However, this appears as unique for a certain type of states and populations. But if you take the perspective of an indigenous group in the global south, well, you've been under polycrisis for pretty much 5 or 6 centuries, since the beginning of capitalism in the long 16th century and the European imperial expansion and so on, which I think is a valid point. And the second one, the more Marxist critique of this, would say, well, it's true that it seems that we are living a moment where you have those separate crises which interact and perhaps mutually constitute themselves and overlap in different ways. And that's important. But what's also important is to recognize the common roots of a lot of those crises and to understand them as differentiated aspects of the same dynamics of historical development. And obviously, they would say the historical development and geographical remaking of global capitalism is kind of the root cause of all of those things. And if that is true, then we must understand that and grasp it, or grasp this polycrisis as in those terms, right? So as a result of the same set of historical processes, rather than simply an overlapping of different relatively autonomous crises and events.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I think there's definitely an element, not maybe an element, maybe it is constitutive that this is a crisis of the liberal order in the transatlantic, the US and Europe, and perhaps the sort of the accelerating sense of a loss of control from the rise of, state power and wealth in Asia and outside the hands of the transatlantic core. And in that sense, maybe this is a diagnosis of liberals and liberal elites in the transatlantic world. And I definitely have a lot of time for that. It's just that when you look at the states, you go and talk to Indians, or you go and talk to people in China, and they have a sense of confidence that they can deal with these overlapping, escalating crises, because they're like, look at where we were 30 years ago and look at where we are now. The world looks rapidly different and much for the better. We have high-speed trains and bridges and roads and all of that. And everybody's a whole lot richer, and our medical systems are functioning or better than they were 30 years ago. So this is a direction of change that gives us the ability to weather the storm. So there's that sort of level of confidence coming from the material realities around you looking very different. And so when you look at the world throwing crises at you, you say, well, we can adapt and deal with them. We have the resources to do that. But then when I also look at other bits of Asia, you look at Bangladesh, you look at Pakistan, and they're both, you look at Sri Lanka, and, they're all involved in highly concentrated ecological and economic crises, a debt crises in the subcontinent, wars in West Asia, and so on. And then you ask yourself, well, who really is confident of dealing with this over the next 20 or 30 years? And there is a deep sort of undercurrent of pessimism as well amongst Asian elites or the Asian middle classes, that actually we are in a very, very difficult state. And sure, we have some reasons to be confident, but there's no reason to expect that the world will continually look better for us over the next 30 years as well. But I just wanted to mark that there is a very pronounced difference in the level of confidence and optimism that people have in the transatlantic world about their futures and in fast-growing Asia.
Tim, you missed the memo that America is now great again. So our confidence is back. The vibes are immaculate.
Right. But I actually think there's something really going on, not just, us people on the left like to focus on, well, what is materially true and what is the discourse about? And, there's a gap between what people are talking about and what is actually, quote unquote, happening. But, I think one of the constitutive elements of the polycrisis is this sort of like kaleidoscope of narratives about what we're going through, right? So, we on the left have these narratives of the 1% sort of have taken away jobs and incomes and wealth and stability from us. And, the establishment has a view that free trade got us prosperity and, we should, it's a win-win for everyone. The right wing has a narrative right now which says, China took away your jobs. The left wing has another narrative which says, corporations don't pay any taxes. We run around paying all of our taxes and so on. We say things like climate change changes everything. And each of these narratives is deeply contested. And I think there's something about this polycrisis where we have to pay attention to what are these narratives that people say that marry something that might be objectively true, but with some values and with a storyline, which is a very clear sort of story of what just happened, who's responsible, and what must be done, like the classic political questions. And I think with the polycrisis, we really have to pay attention to other people's narratives and theories about what is going on.
Ilias, you recently participated in a really interesting report from the Transnational Institute called Geopolitics of Capitalism, State of Power 2025. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes so listeners can check it out. But a question that's posed in a really, really great opening interview with Adam Tooze and Walden Bello is, are we living in a multipolar world now? And it's a question I struggle to answer because on the one hand, the U.S. still has vastly more economic and military power than much of the rest of the world combined. And yet, China's rise continues, and Russia has upended the Atlanticist alliance while playing this huge role in scrambling domestic politics across the continent where far-right parties are on the rise, a dynamic that's been dramatically intensified by the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Trump's United States has given up on a certain form of American empire, and that's an empire, of course, whose legitimacy was wrecked not just by Trump. It's an empire that involves this U.S.-backed liberal international order that was absolutely shredded by the Gaza genocide. And we could really go back even further than that to the Bush administration's unilateralist, Western alliance-based war on terror and the invasion of Iraq. Why does the U.S. seem more powerful than ever, but also very much on the brink of terminal decline?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I mean, I think there's no little doubt that we live in a multipolar world. There's a lot of way in which you can document this. But simply put, the way the world economy looks now is the way in which economic activities are distributed. If you look at global patterns of trade and investment, all of that suggests that we live in a multipolar world. This is the outcome of a historical process that started in the mid-20th century, which has started with the formation of new international divisions of labor in the late 50s, early 60s, with transnational corporations from the West starting to offshore some of their production capacities in low-income countries in the third world. And this process has radically accelerated throughout the 90s, especially in the early 2000s, with the deepening and extension of this new international division of labor, the formation of very complex supply and value chains, global production networks, and so on. Simply to characterize that in geographical terms, we can say that there's been a concentration of labor-intensive manufacturing activities in East Asia and then in Southeast Asia, with some other pockets of such activities in Central America, perhaps North Africa, and other places. You also then had the formation of supply chains that connect those areas of labor-intensive manufacturing to spaces of advanced high-tech production in East Asia and in some bits in Western Europe and North America, as well as advanced services in those spaces and spaces of consumption and so on. And then thirdly, you get lots of countries and regions of the world which have doubled down on extractivism, producing and extracting natural resources, mining commodities, raw materials, foodstuff for exports. So you have this kind of broad geographical structure which is at the core of the world economy. Now that has offered the material basis for what we now call multipolarity, which is that with this redistribution of economic activities, you do get also, to some extent, a reshuffling of geopolitical and political force fields. And that has partly forced realignments in what you could call the imperial or the imperialist hierarchy of global capitalism, with shifts in relations of forces between the traditional centers of power, of course, the US being the leading hegemon in that structure, but also the more traditional centers of power like Western Europe, the EU, and so on. And of course, some new centers of power becoming more assertive, China being one of them, but you can also think about emerging economies like India, Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, as well as the reassertiveness of formal imperial powers like Russia, which have those kind of renewed imperial or post-imperial and geopolitical ambitions, which of course, you can't kind of reduce those ambitions to the story that I just told, but they're important as well. So there is undoubtedly, in my view, a form of multipolarity in terms of geopolitics, which is rooted in this historical development and geographical remaking of capitalism over the past 50 years at least, and which has accelerated over the past maybe 10 years. Now, of course, this is forcing some actors to adjust quite radically to that. So you could say that the US was the kind of the superintendent of this order throughout the second half of the 20th century, as Sam Gindin and Leo Panitch would put it. As an imperial power, was the superintendent of global capitalism, was kind of playing this role actively, and has now decided that it's no longer in its interest to continue performing this role, and is stepping back from it and focusing on other imperial assertions of power. So those kind of deep trends are important to understand ongoing behaviors on the part of contender states, traditional hegemonic powers, and regional political ambitions across the world economy.
Yeah, I think whether or not the world is multipolar or not, I mean, maybe you could just say it feels like it. So multipolarity, this is actually a very active debate in international relations. And everyone would sort of say, yes, it's the end of unipolarity. And there was a uniquely unipolar moment in which most of our post-1990s liberal integration of free markets and free trade and production systems sort of took place under American hegemony, and sort of like a US-led unipolar moment where other powers were substantially weakened. So the Soviet Union collapsed and China only got rich much later in the 2000s and 2010s. But that still doesn't mean that the world is fully bipolar. So you kind of have to, or multipolar. And so how do you instrumentalize these? And one is just to say exactly what Ilias said, is that the production system just looks multipolar. So from a production point of view, you just have a lot of non-G7, non-US, EU, Japan, Korea sort of production system. From the point of view of the dollar order, the world is very much still anchored on the US Fed and Treasury. From the point of view of nuclear and the arms race and the world that we've lived in since 1945, that world isn't very multipolar at all. There's just a handful of nuclear powers, and the most nuclear weapons still exist only in the hands of US and Russia. So from the point of view of sort of armed power, it's not very clear that it's multipolar. You might still just call it mostly a tripolar world with US, China, and Russia holding nuclear power. And it matters hugely. Like if you're thinking about what does future military power look like, you could just say, well, let's just have a look at our production systems and just conclude that any country with enough economic might could convert that into military might in the future. So the GDP is a good proxy. And you could just say, well, the world is then multipolar. But I'm not so convinced that the world is actually multipolar. We might just be in a bipolar world with US, China, or if you're thinking about the arms race, it's US, China, and Russia.
But isn't even in that context clear tripolarity quite a shock to American dominance, given this very overconfident presumption of unipolarity that guided the U.S.?
I think that's exactly right. And if you look at the U.S. national security state, it issues a 5-year sort of planning document in 2017 and did it again in 2022. And in those, they sort of have a self-critique that said we overextended ourselves and we went after rogue states and the war on terror in the unipolar moment in the 90s and 2000s. And those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, etc., weakened American power, and we kept our eyes off the ball. We should have been focused just on Russia and China and just focused on what they call our peer competitors. And so it's an element of self-critique by the Pentagon military intellectuals, which basically says that was a mistake. Everything that we did in the 1990s to the mid-2010s was a mistake. We undermined our power. We should have kept our armed posture and our military technology development, not to go after, in their view, jihadis in the deserts, but instead we should have focused upon the key components of military strength of, the three armed forces that we should have strengthened to fight great power conflict and not to go after rogue states. So there's a very key element of sort of self-learning, and at the unipolar moment, we sort of weakened ourselves and overextended our military, and we need to go back to basics.
I agree with a lot of what you said, Tim. And I just say that the argument that we live in a multipolar world, or at least the sophisticated version of this argument, would not be to say that economic power or technological power, financial power, and monetary power, and so on, are evenly distributed. They're obviously not. So that's obviously true and important. And secondly, multipolarity manifests very differently in those different areas of social life or of geo-economic competition, if you will. So, but that said, it's clear that in some of those areas, at least, where the U.S. as still the leading imperial power is in position of unchallenged domination, like in questions of money and finance. But in other areas, it's clearly being challenged very powerfully by other actors, such as China. And there's also areas where China is actually already leading. It's not in the position of catching up in any way. So if you think about clean tech and renewable powers and so on, China, EVs, EV batteries, China is kind of leading in those areas now. So emphasizing that multipolarity is kind of reshuffling geopolitical force fields is not to say that this is the end of the extreme strength of the US in some particular areas of finance, tech, and money. And military, of course, but there's things changing, and it's I think there's no doubt about this, and surely that has something to say or to contribute to the conversation of on the polycrisis, right? I mean, there's something about this distribution of power globally that is changing.
Yeah, and that relative gain, like where it has shrunk and where that matters hugely, right? Like the fact that China has risen very suddenly in the last 30 years matters hugely to how American elites view their relative status in the world.
Yeah, and on that, there's also the crises often appear to accelerate those trends. So a lot of us were shocked at how after the COVID crisis, China emerged as a leader in clean tech and renewables and so on. But of course, something had started before that, right? And likewise, the 2008 global financial crisis seemed to suggest that there's a before and after crisis in terms of the liberal international order, in terms of the US position in that order. But I mean, what I'm trying to suggest here is that those crises are perhaps better seen as catalyzers of trends rather than moments that change everything completely.
Let's get into this a bit more in terms of what's happening with the U.S.'s perceived interest in running an imperial liberal international order, and more specifically, how the U.S.'s new Cold War with China evolved over Biden's presidency and what it looks like now that Trump is back at the helm. We saw Biden's escalation with China following Trump's. We saw Biden's ultimately becoming entwined with the anti-Russian Atlanticist revival just 3 years ago. We saw NATO's big moment in the face of the Russian invasion, which was also a reassertion of a crisis-ridden alliance and the broader order that alliance played such a big role in upholding, reasserting that in the wake of Trump's 2020 defeat. Now we have Trump back, and he's maintaining that hawkish posture towards China while shattering the Western alliance as we knew it. Meanwhile, of course, once again, just to repeat it, threatening to seize the Panama Canal, Greenland, and Canada, all of which mark this reassertion of control in the Americas, a close-to-home empire, the oldest sort of U.S. imperial sphere of influence dating back to the Monroe Doctrine. But But then he also has this insane and cruel plan for Gaza, which is an exception of this American conquest close to home, made possible by, I think, pretty straightforwardly, just the unshakable settler colonial alliance with Israel. And in the TNI report that you participated in, Ilias, Waldenbello called it a, quote, defensive imperialism as opposed to the expansive imperialism of the liberal internationalist project. How should we conceive of these distinctions and shifts in U.S. imperialist theory and strategy if according something called theory or strategy to Trump isn't a little too much, and how those distinctions and shifts relate to the larger bipartisan anti-China project?
Yeah, so I think a couple things to say on that. One is that I think that Waldenbello's the heuristics that he uses, this notion of defensive imperialism and expansive imperialism, and those are quite helpful categories to think about different modalities of U.S. imperial power. Now, his argument is that the U.S., was relying a lot more on the expansive variant of it, partly as a result or of its role in constructing this liberal international order and leading this order. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, it's clear that the US has very powerfully underpinned this order and has written a lot of the rules of that order because it benefited the US state and US corporate capital and global capital as a whole. And it's true that there seems to be, at the moment, a move away from that position where, on the contrary, the American state seems to be undermining that order quite actively. Quite surprisingly, in fact, because it was people would argue until quite recently that the threats to the international liberal order would come from outside. It would come from China, Russia, or elsewhere. But it turns out that those threats might exist, but the US is actually the prime saboteur of this order at the moment. So that's one thing to say. The other thing to say, though, is that I think that US imperial power was always predicated upon those two modalities of power, both the defensive imperialism bit and the expansive imperialism one. So you can think about the 80s, for instance, or the late 70s with the Volcker shock, where the US Fed makes this very consequential decision to raise interest rates domestically very rapidly to deal with domestic issues of stagflation and so on, while being very well aware that this would wreak havoc on the rest of the world, including developing countries, and trigger this horrible debt crisis. So you can very much see that as a case or as a manifestation of defensive imperialism. Likewise, when there were trade tensions between the US, Japan, and Germany in the 80s, the Plaza Accords were very much about the US forcing those geo-economic competitors to suck it in and to accept the revalorization of their exchange rates to benefit US corporate interests. So this too could be seen as a manifestation of defensive imperialism. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that US imperial power has always worked on those two levels, mobilizing both defensive mechanisms and expansive ones or outward-oriented ones. However, as I intimated earlier, it seems quite clear that the US is backing off from its purposeful role of superintendent of global capitalism. Just doesn't want to do this anymore. It doesn't seem to benefit US corporate interests, or it perceives that it's not benefiting those interests. And likewise, the American state seems not to be interested in doing so. We can discuss why, but I think it's hard to argue against this. So this is where I see the change. So more than a shift from expansive imperialism to defensive one, what I'm seeing is rather a change from actively acting as the superintendent of global capitalism to another form of imperial power, which is much more explicitly self-interested and is very willing to undermine the rules that it had previously set up internationally.
This is an interesting question as to whether the United States is just sort of concentrating its aggression only on Canada and Mexico and sort of the Western Hemisphere, and sort of retrenching and pulling back from Europe. I mean, that is clearly what the Trumpists want. They want, as they say, more burden sharing of the costs of providing military defense and the costs of providing global reserve assets. So in their view, everything that foreigners do is sort of, out to get the United States. And therefore, the United States needs to retrench and allow its allies to do sort of more of take up the cost in blood and treasure of defending global capitalism or whatever. So they get Europe to say, you should pony up the cash, you should pony up an army, and we are going to pull out our efforts in Europe and perhaps even NATO from Europe. And why that is happening, is it because they want to concentrate their aggression on the North America and South America, or is it because they're pulling out from Europe because they would rather concentrate all of their forces in Asia? As far as I understand, like that is the kind of thinking that the Trump defense secretary and sort of the thinking in the Pentagon is going, is that basically their diagnosis is China is a monster. United States needs to concentrate all of its forces and might and power and economic sort of attention on East Asia. And Europe is sort of rich enough to defend itself, and it should just pony up the cash and men to defend itself, while the United States pulls everything to China. And that, in some sense, is a diagnosis of relative American weakness, right? It basically says we don't see us getting any stronger relative to China in the future. And therefore, our existing sort of force posture of trying to defend both Europe and Asia is not possible. We just need to pull entirely and pivot to Asia in sort of the true way. And we had already sort of seen this kind of force deployments changing from the Persian Gulf and going to East Asia under Obama. Biden has accelerated that by sort of adding more carriers and more military bases in the Western Pacific. So this is definitely sort of a continuation, and maybe it's just a diagnosis of American weakness that we can't be everywhere all at once. And other allies, if they want to protect themselves, should take up the cost of burden sharing. So I it might be done in an extremely wild and insane way by Trump, but there is an underlying sort of logic to a retrenchment.
And perhaps one way that we could synthesize these seemingly contradictory things of retrenching back into the Western Hemisphere and doubling down on the new Cold War with China is that the idea is to consolidate the near-to-home empire, which can be done relatively easily and cheaply and safely without putting boots on the ground that are going to, look like something like the Iraq War, consolidating that near-to-home imperial power precisely to marshal all the possible resources and power necessary to contain and confront China.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, although I do find it convincing to a large extent, and yet there's, there would be gap in that reasoning insofar as if indeed the project or the strategy is to pivot yet again towards East Asia, to take seriously China's threat, so to speak, into consideration, then why would you mess up your relationship with Canada and Mexico as much? It just seems to be adding trouble. So this is where it's kind of hard to find a sort of unified logic, fully consistent, fully articulated and thought out in some of those actions. I mean, surely there's, as I said earlier, I do believe that they're embedded in particular set of structures that give them meaning and so on. And so there is some sort of structure to them. And yet it's impossible to completely capture, unified understanding what they hope to achieve. But I think what's happening to Mexico and Canada is not a coincidence, and you're entirely right that there's something about those two being in the backdoor, or being considered to be the backdoor of the U.S., and that's just a pure assertion of imperial power in the crudest sense. I think that's quite obvious. But then again, does that all serve well the attempt of like addressing or boosting the US's role in the second Cold War? This isn't clear to me at this point.
Well, what can we glean about that in terms of what approach Trump has taken or signaled that he'll take in terms of the US's many Asian allies that have been so critical for more recently the US strategy of containing China, but just generally across the entire post-World War II period, ensuring American dominance across the Pacific? These are huge alliances founded on major military and economic cooperation with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, India? What can we discern about what Trump intends? We've discussed the U.S. shredding the Western alliance. What do we know about his intentions towards Pacific allies and Asian allies and how that fits into the new Cold War strategy?
I mean, I'll just take this just going from where Biden has left us. So no one really knows what Trump's Asia policy looks like. So I'm not even sure what it is. But what we saw under Biden was putting together the China Containment Alliance, exactly as you put it, with the Quad, with Japan, Australia, and India and the United States being the preeminent sort of Pacific military power. And with all of those three countries, the United States did something similar. Well, what weapons do you need? You could buy those from us. Do you need like some technological collaboration to develop yourselves? So India got various deals with the United States with Biden Modi visits promising American technology to manufacture artillery, drones. Apple is going to come and invest in India and make chips and smartphones and et cetera, et cetera. So the Indians really leveraged that relationship with the United States, which said, we need to become stronger to defend against China, and therefore you, the United States, should be helping us technologically to do that. And then, all of the military bases were expanded all across the South China Seas and in the Philippines in particular. And a lot of sort of military coordination, particularly between the navies, so that they could defend the first island chain or do drills to see if you can blockade the Straits of Malacca, et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely a tighter technological cooperation, tighter military cooperation. And then many American allies in East Asia, particularly Japan and Korea, started to de-risk themselves from China and increase their trade integration with the United States. And, even if you look at the IRA and the amount of subsidies rolled out for clean manufacturing in batteries and EVs, it's a made in America bill to attract onshoring incentives for manufacturing, but it's a made by Japan and Korea bill. So the vast chunks of the EV firms and the battery firms that located manufacturing into the United States are East Asian, not Chinese, but East Asian. And so in that sense, that's sort of like a very powerful coalition that was built in Asia to contain China's rise. The question of where that goes, does Trump sort of increase the level of cooperation, or does he sort of, do this sort of, you have to pay me tributes, like, I don't see any benefit to defending you guys. The kind of statement that he made against Japan very recently is just like, hey, pony up, where's the cash? Like, you guys you got a massive trade surplus with the United States. You need to be buying more American stuff. And if, from the point of view of an American ally in the Pacific, from the point of view of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, etc., they're like, oh, he might actually hurt us economically with tariffs. Therefore, what should we do? Well, we should bend over backwards and reduce our surplus with the United States. How do we do that? Buy more American LNG, buy more American weapons. Like, he's telling us what to do. Let's just do that. Because if we don't do that, we might risk losing military protection and so on and so on. So this is like a terrible kind of a bind for East Asian states in particular, which is already facing this enormous costs of like trying to de-risk from China and pull out some of their investments in China. And the United States just poses a very blunt question. You've got to pick a side, and you might have to hurt yourself economically, but you'll be protected from a security lens. And that's why, this conversation that we're having with geoeconomics is really interesting, because states are sometimes willing to suffer and impose pain upon themselves economically as long as their security interests are guaranteed.
Those were excellent points, Tim. The case of Taiwan is quite interesting. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, just a few days ago, it was either Trump or someone in the Trump administration basically also saying that Taiwan shouldn't expect the unconditional support of the American state or something to that effect. And so you might wonder, what's the objective of those kind of statements, really? and to what extent that fits within an actual plan about the Asia Pacific region. But a couple of days after that, there was an announcement of TSMC, the national champion of Taiwan, in terms of advanced semiconductors, which was about investing in additional manufacturing capacities in the US. So perhaps some of it is just, again, about those transactional deals. And, you could say that to some extent they kind of may sabotage the broader or the consistency of the strategy in the region, but they seem to be equally important than the broader plan to pivot towards Asia in the struggle against China.
What were the consequences of the Biden administration delegitimizing the liberal international order on the way out the door in the way that it did? How can we think of how Biden's overwhelming, unflinching support for Israel's genocide in Gaza remade the very world order that Trump is now stepping into running? And I mean, we could even perhaps trace the legitimacy crisis for the liberal international order that became so overwhelmingly clear with the Gaza genocide. We could trace it back further still to George W. Bush, to his unilateralist war on terror and invasion of Iraq, to his policy of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, a policy that ended up being far more consequential than most people were willing to consider at the time. We could include the economic crisis of 2007. To echo something you said earlier, Ilias, we could trace it back much further to, if you're a Central American in the 1980s or 1950s, or if you're an Iranian in the 1950s, if you're an Egyptian in the 1950s, there's a sense in which the legitimacy of the liberal international order was always very much contested. So I guess that's a long way of asking what the sort of significance of the legitimacy crisis provoked by Israel's genocide in Gaza and the U.S. support for that, where that fits into that longer struggle over the legitimacy of the liberal international order and U.S. empire.
Yeah, I think it was, as you very nicely said, this is probably the final nail in the coffin. It's best to say it that way, particularly because it comes from the Biden administration, which was supposed to be this kind of responsible, self-conscious liberal project coming after Trump, and was supposed to restore some sort of legitimacy and moral leadership of the United States and of this order, international order that it leads. But then there was this awful genocidal war supported by the US, which came after vaccine apartheid during the COVID pandemic, double standards of treating the Russian invasion in some way and Israel's invasion of Gaza in some other way. As you said, the devastation of the imperial wars in the Middle East. All of that has, I think, contributed quite deeply to this crisis of the liberal international order. And what it did quite concretely is consolidate the view in many countries across the global south that the narrative that is currently being built around the notion of the US leading a sort of Western alliance against rogue states in the East, Russia, China, and other rogue states, but this narrative being emphasizing the fight between democracy and authoritarianism and so on. This doesn't ring true at all to the ears of many leaders in the global south. And there's increasing disillusion with those kind of claims and with the moral superiority of the West in that respect. So what this does, again, in concrete terms, is that it's encouraging a lot of those Southern leaders to try and articulate positions in geopolitical terms, which are about neither aligning with the West or the East, so to speak. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this in a moment, but there's been this kind of re-embrace of the jargon of non-alignment in quite interesting ways as of late. And I think this does speak to the kind of crisis of legitimacy of the liberal international order, which simply does not inspire anymore anyone.
Yeah, I think if you think about the legitimacy is, it's always this kind of like you have to consent to some level of coercion, and as there's all this is what power and an order really means. is the balance between that consent and coercion. And so if people sort of feel that the order isn't legitimate, then they take steps to sort of remove themselves from it. And if the order is meant to sort of create peace and stability, this is liberalism's like ideology, right? It says we do free markets, it makes you richer and it makes you safer and it increases your individual freedoms. And so liberalism as an ideology it depends upon people buying that sort of story and thinking of it as legitimate. And I think particularly, I think that the shredding of that legitimacy, as Ilias was saying, is essentially the difference of the West's treatment in the defense of Ukraine and allowing a genocide in Gaza. And that particular sort of clear, you see those ridiculous headlines that contrast the way Western newspapers write about Israel and write about Russia, which are, very identical sort of actions of destroying possibilities of civilian life in cities. It just breaks your mind looking at those things, right? And if you imagine everyone sort of consuming these images day in, day out for 2-3 years now, you can see how people lose all faith in any word that comes out of a liberal Western leader's mouth, right? And that is the shredding of legitimacy when we talk about it, right? It's not just about grand terms like order and liberalism and so on. It's just this sort of this contrast. And as Ilias was saying, this contrast was also really seen during the vaccine apartheid, right? Like we were content to let millions of people die of a virus. Well, I don't know, I had like 5 shots in my arm, by the end of the pandemic. And it was really staggering to see that sort of not just like disregard for life elsewhere, but a real resort to, Fortress North America and Fortress Europe, and that we are going to grab vaccines and masks from the world market and put it towards our citizens' welfare and not towards yours. If there's a shortage of energy, well, we're going to take it from you. If we are sanctioning Russia and prices of energy shoot up, well, Europe is willing to pay top dollar to grab gas from the rest of the world. And you had the spectacle of companies that are meant to deliver a cargo of gas to Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Pakistan. And they just literally turn the ship in the middle of the ocean and go back to Europe and say, you know what, I'm fetching a price 10 times if I sell to the Europeans. And what is the actual result of that? Well, blackouts in Pakistan, blackouts in Bangladesh, in half a dozen other countries where people are literally living in the dark because of an order that just sort of whoever's got the more ability to pay for it will just get any entity that is in shortage, whether it's vaccines, whether it's energy, whether it's food. And so that picture is, again, extremely delegitimizing to an order where it's one rule for one and another rule for others. And so when Trump sort of comes along and actually says it quite transparently, well, might makes right, and it's the law of the jungle, and we are going to use our strength to beat back people. People are like, well, at least he's frank about it, because that's exactly what it looked like over the last 5 years.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Nuclear is Not the Solution by M.V. Ramana. The climate crisis has propelled nuclear energy back into fashion, with proponents calling it the technology of the future. In Nuclear is Not the Solution, professor and author M.V. Ramana demonstrates why this sort of thinking is not only naive, but dangerous. Ramana explores the costs, both environmental and financial, involved in the production of nuclear energy, and examines why governments and private corporations continue to support it anyway. Naomi Klein describes the book as a devastatingly convincing case against the dangerous distractions of nuclear energy, a major contribution destined to change countless minds. Listeners can buy Nuclear is Not the Solution directly from versobooks.com and save 40% at checkout using discount code DIG. That's all caps, DIG. Everywhere, not everywhere, but it feels like everywhere, we've seen states abandoning certain norms around their relationship to markets and private industry that had long prevailed during the high tide of neoliberalism. Ilias, you and colleagues in this new Transnational Institute report, you call this, quote, state capitalist geopolitics. And unlike the first Cold War, you write, quote, this new conflict centers not on ideology or territorial expansion, but on the control of strategic global networks. What are state capitalist geopolitics, and how are we seeing them emerge in different ways in different parts of the world? And then how did we get to this point in the first place when for so long, particularly from the American perspective, free markets were what guaranteed American global hegemony? The idea was not only to encourage people to accept free trade, as you write, Ilias, but to impose it by force if necessary, because what was required for U.S. dominance, for the dominance of the U.S.-backed liberal international order, was that every single country be subject to market discipline. What happened, and what's this new thing you're describing?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dan. So this is some work that I've been doing with the brilliant colleagues and comrades at the Second Cold War Observatory. So we kind of came up with this notion of state capitalist geopolitics to try and make sense of two things. One is the purpose and nature of geopolitics today, or geopolitical competition today. And the other is the particular forms and instruments which are used in this new era of geopolitics. So I'll just start by saying a few words about the first one, which is that we talked a bit about the First Cold War and the idea that geopolitics during the First Cold War was arguably mostly based around the idea that you had two competing blocks on ideological terms. Those blocks were supposed to be defined by competing political economic models, liberal capitalism in one case and state socialism in the other case. And those blocks were competing for influence, including in territorial terms. So a lot of geopolitical rivalry was about containing the territorial influence and expansion of the other bloc, the so-called geopolitics of containment. There was then, the end of the First Cold War and the rise of this new unipolar moment, which we've discussed earlier. During that period, which was also a period of what we can call neoliberal geopolitics. So this is a term which was coined by Sue Roberts, Matt Spark, and other economic geographers. And that indeed referred to the idea that geopolitics during that period and imperial power was geared toward forcefully integrated populations and countries and spaces into the world market, including via military interventions and violence and so on and so forth. And that was indeed to bring those people, territories, regions within the ambit of liberal capitalism and subject them to market disciplines. Now, what we've seen is a move to a third modality of geopolitics, which we call state capitalist politics. And this has to be understood in the context of the move from the First Cold War to the Second Cold War. So this Second Cold War is about geopolitical competition, but in the context of a world economy which is tightly economically integrated. Again, this is the result or an outcome of neoliberal globalization and the expansion of global trade, production networks, investment flows, and so on. So as a result of that process of neoliberal globalization throughout the 80s and 90s and early 2000, we ended up in a situation where the economy is structured in such a way that countries are extremely economically interdependent. Those economies are organized by what we call strategic economic networks, production networks, digital networks, financial networks, infrastructure networks, and so on, which span territorial borders. And that means that even geoeconomic or geopolitical rivals are dependent upon each other. So we argue that this gives a new flavor to geopolitics today, which is less about territorial containment, as during the First Cold War, and much more about connectivity. So the idea here is that instead of trying to contain territorially your rivals, geoeconomic powers try to vie for control for those strategic global networks. And that's because if you control key nodes in those networks, or if you're able to shape those networks in particular ways, that could be the source of tremendous economic and political power. So that's about the first bit that I talked about earlier, about the purpose and nature of geopolitical competition. Now, the second bit, which is about the state capitalist bit of the state capitalist geopolitics, is about the instruments which are used by states and governments in this new era of geopolitical rivalry. And here, what we can see is that as they vie for control of those strategic global economic networks, states are intervening much more actively in their economies and societies via things like active industrial policies, tariffs, investment restrictions, various forms of economic nationalism, investment in infrastructure, but also by remobilizing various forms of state ownership. So things like sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, development and policy banks, state-owned venture capital funds, and so on. So a lot of different types of state-owned corporate entities, assets, and capital. Now, those are used by governments and states, as I said, as they try and intervene and reshape those networks of economic globalizations. Hence, the term state capitalist geopolitics, to kind of capture the essence and the form of geopolitics at the current moment. Now, as you suggested in your question, of course, this, although we argue is a global process, manifests very unevenly across regions and countries. So the tools that the Chinese government, for instance, uses look quite different from the tools that the American government uses. What a country like Russia, the ways in which this country acts is quite different from, say, Morocco and so on. And that's because countries are also differentially positioned in the world economy and differently positioned with respect to those global strategic networks.
Yeah, Tim, what happened to the bipartisan belief in the U.S. and shared by many elsewhere in the power of free markets and free people, and not needing to worry about actually so precisely and intentionally engineering your economics to serve your foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like kind of breathtaking, right? Like with the Starlink stuff where Elon Musk is like, you know what, I'm just going to turn off the satellites over Ukraine, and now you can't conduct a war without my satellites, right? So like you can have things like, we're going to go after and sanction somebody's ability to use a bank account. And that could be an entire country. It could be targeted lists of people. So, what Ilias and his co-authors have done is really remarkable, is like really lay out how these infrastructures were built, and they look like very neutral infrastructures, right? What could be more neutral than just a bank payment system? What could be more neutral than just, it's just internet, it's just pipes connecting people, right? So during the 90s and 2000s, we had all of these like ideas of integration that were just presented as neutral. There's no state power there. This is just commerce. And I think I'd just like to say that, like, while it looks like it's being weaponized extremely aggressively in exactly the ways that he described with export controls, what can you buy? What can you sell? Who can you buy it from? Who can you sell it to? Which websites can you access? Can your bank account, work or not? Or can your phones or your maps or your GPS, whatever, work over you, right? Like this suddenly feels like a bit of a shock. And I'd like to say that I think we started to see how state power is sort of used to achieve the state's ends using these networked globalization things post 9/11. So post 9/11, the United States National Security State said, we're going to launch a crusade to like stop these jihadis from accessing money and weapons and arms in wherever they were, hiding in their caves. I'm just sort of speaking the way that they talk, right? And then they say, well, how do we do that? Well, we are going to use and empower our treasury to hunt down their bank accounts to stop them from getting money. We are going to empower the National Security Agency to actively eavesdrop on the entire, this is Snowden's sort of surveillance internet sort of revelations in the late 2000s, where he says, look, all of these neutral tech companies that are giving you technological services and internet services, they run a pipeline straight into the NSA, right? And so American sort of state power was used to already go and weaponize the pipelines of information in the internet, the pipelines of money in the banking system and the SWIFT sort of clearance systems. And these sort of key choke points that are largely located and operated in the G7 countries were weaponized. And the only reason they could be weaponized is because they had been stitched together in the first place, right? And so this is this concept of weaponized interdependence that many scholars have sort of come up with, that the liberalization and the integration is precisely what allows you to then weaponize if the state chooses to start certain crusades. So the 9/11 crusade, and then in the 2010s, the crusades against China. Crusade is too loaded of a term. The containment of China and the containment of Russia. And we are going to use these tools at our disposal to starve enemies from power, wealth, information, military, weapons, industrial might, etc. And they're sort of weaponized in a very networked way. And I think networked is the really important part of Ilias's work, which is we don't just sort of directly stop the flow of chips going from America to China. We go to other people who sell chips and chip-making technology, the Dutch, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, and ask them to stop selling advanced chips to China. So it's very clearly sort of it relies upon other actors to obey. And that's what gives the weaponization a very, very interesting flavor of, well, are the people going to obey you? Is a Western chip maker sitting in Taiwan, sitting in Japan, in the Netherlands, actually going to obey American diktat? And you kind of see that these weapons that we feel that we are using to achieve certain ends may not actually achieve those ends, because other people, the enemy gets a vote, and other allies get a vote in whether they choose to obey American diktat.
Yeah, just to add a quick point on that, I think it's there's brilliant work by people like Newnham and I think their name is Newnham and Farrell, The Underground Empire. This book on how American state actors basically stumbled upon those tools and just realized that they could create a lot of damage by using the payment systems and financial networks and so on. So that's one thing, and in this. And you're entirely right, Tim, to say that this is, of course, the result of the period of economic integration that preceded that. But then what I would just add to that is that what we're trying to get at with this notion of state capitalist geopolitics is that there's something perhaps more to simply trying to weaponize those networks. There's something about trying to control key nodes in them. There's something about reshaping them and altogether and so on and so forth. So there's something about the logic of this state capitalist geopolitics. The other thing to say, too, is that the reason why state ownership in particular is being used extensively as part of this new state capitalist geopolitics is because of how the world economy has developed over the past 20 to 30 years. We've seen, the increasing financialization of the economy, which has triggered all sorts of crises, which have required states to massively intervene, and often by nationalizing banks, de facto nationalizing bank, or vastly expanding the balance sheets of central banks, or using national and state-owned banks as a means to act in a counter-cyclical way to mitigate crises. You've also seen state enterprises across all sorts of sectors being remobilized to address all sorts of so-called market failures, often in sectors where competition has become toughest between countries and firms and states, but also because in sectors where neoliberalism had done a terrible job at delivering anything. You can think about infrastructure in particular and public services and so on. So there were a few kind of structural reasons for which a lot of state-owned corporate entities had been re-embraced by governments across the world. Now, as we move into this new era of geopolitical competition, those tools have appeared ready to be mobilized now for specifically geopolitical purposes. So this is also something that a lot of states have stumbled upon. All of a sudden, as they started to develop new means to shape those networks, as I've described earlier, they realized that they already had potential tools to do that because of those other kind of crisis and development in global capitalism.
Trump imposed massive tariffs on Mexico and Canada after briefly pausing them, which then immediately led to a massive stock sell-off that erased all of the post-election gains that had been made. And so he paused them again. He also imposed tariffs on China and threatened impending tariffs on Europe. And he's done all of this in the name of rebalancing trade in the U.S.'s favor, and also, in the case of Mexico and Canada, purportedly to stop immigration and fentanyl trafficking. Trump also threatened tariffs on Colombia when President Gustavo Petro resisted the humiliating, dehumanizing way that deportation flights were being conducted. What is Trump doing with tariffs, and what sort of precedent, if any, is there for all of this? And I should note to listeners, and I want to emphasize that quite possibly all of the latest news on Trump tariffs might have changed multiple times by the time we release this episode. So please check our discussion against the Financial Times.
I mean, I'll just start with, like, the man said he's going to do tariffs. He does tariffs. I've been very surprised at the market reaction, which is just like, he's not going to do it. He's just saying it. And you're like, no, this is like one of his bedrock economic beliefs. Foreigners are screwing us. The trade surplus is a sign of people screwing Americans. And therefore, what Trump has been wanting to do is erect tariff walls and trade barriers against the Japanese in the 1980s, against the Chinese when he launched. Trump won a trade war, and against literally the entire planet in Trump too. So I just find it very funny that the market had this sort of delayed reaction, which was essentially economic rationality would assert itself against the sort of self-destructive nature of the tariffs. And why are these tariffs kind of self-destructive? Like, what were people like Biden and the Democrats saying in 2018, 2019 when Trump launched this tariff war? I mean, they said what like the markets say now, which is this is going to make everything costly and expensive for Americans. This is going to disrupt our allies in the world who, will not cooperate with American foreign policy if they only feel the stick and no carrots. And, all of those things are still true. And so those companies and other countries are reacting against American tariffs and launching retaliatory measures, which then, you get into kind of like a circle drain of the entire global economy might shrink. And that's one of the reasons why there's been sort of a stock sell-off, that there'll just be lower growth in the future. But I think we should also think about a little bit like why the tariffs on Canada and Mexico are 25% and the tariffs on China this time around, the additional tariffs are just 10%. And that's been like one of the big puzzles for me is, kind of what we started out thinking through, like why so much aggression on American production and FDI in Canada and in Mexico, which is stitching together a giant factory in North America, which is completely interlinked, interdependent, just-in-time production chains. An average car is made with an engine like whizzing back and forth between Canada and the US, or between Canada, US and Mexico on an average of 7 or 8 times. So if you apply a tariff on them, 25% every time it crosses a border, that truck that was $100 turns $125, $150, $170, it just keeps going up, and the whole production system crawls to a halt. So there's this like extremely damaging sort of if you disrupt the North American production system, the costs on food, on cars, and inflation are extremely disruptive. And, maybe that's what accounts for him finally sort of, realizing that. But the goals of the tariff war are to, as he says, to make America great again, to relocate manufacturing into the United States. And if that's your goal, Canada and Mexico make perfect sense. There's $500 billion of American FDI in Canada. There's $300 billion of American FDI in Mexico. So if you want to relocate American manufacturing, it's actually far easier to get it from Canada and Mexico than it is to get it from all the way from China. And maybe that's what accounts for this differential, just a smaller tariff war on China and a much more aggressive tariff war on Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Tim. I'm not too sure about how to think about those tariffs, to be honest. I mean, one thought is that obviously there's a populist element to it, in relation to the question of immigration coming from Mexico and fentanyl and those kind of things. There's another element, which is that it seems that Trump is trying to tap into those long historical symbols of, the association of tariffs and American state building and nation building and so on, which, I could see why he wants to do that. But thirdly, and this is going to speak more directly to what I've described earlier as state capitalist geopolitics. I mean, it seems that some of those tariffs, when they aim, like you said, Tim, to try and reconfigure supply chains and fortify the position of the US within certain production networks and so on, those seem to be relatively clearly fitting within the picture where the US is engaging in this new form of state capitalist geopolitics. And another example of that, or another case which would lend some credence to this argument, is we can see that when comparing what Biden and Bidenomics try to do in terms of reconfiguring clean tech production networks in the US and renewable energy with the Inflation Reduction Act and other initiatives. And this, I mean, you could interpret this as a clear attempt at competing with China in the area of those networks of renewable energy networks and clean tech networks. Whereas while continuing to extract fossil fuels and boosting the power of the US as a fossil fuel exporter powerhouse. So Bidenomics was about those two things. Now you could say that Trump is about pausing the first for some time. I mean, for now, IRA subsidies and tax credits have been suspended temporarily. We'll see what comes up next, but this is suspended for now. But there is a doubling down on the other aspect, which is trying to fortify or boost the position of the US in those fossil-based energy networks. So it's, what I'm trying to say here is that there is possible to read some sort of logic about the use of tariffs and his use of bullying as a mode of power within the framework of that understanding of new state capitalist geopolitics.
I mean, in terms of the bullying, it doesn't seem to be just about pushing other countries around, but also about exercising domestic power, because the Trump administration, before the Canada-Mexico tariffs were delayed again altogether, they announced a temporary exemption from those tariffs for automakers who depend upon the complex North American production system that Tim was just describing. And they said that they would be open to other companies making the case for themselves, which just presents, knowing anything about Trump, presents the obvious reality that Trump can use tariffs not only to wield power against other countries, but also to force companies domestically to grovel and submit in order to escape punishing economic consequences. There was a tweet you sent to me, Tim, from attorney Blake Allen. He wrote, quote, "Exemption applications in Term 1 became a cottage industry in big law. Firms ended up doing a pipeline of their teams giving donations to Trump and then apply for company-specific exemptions and then push for no systemic exemptions and then lobby to block competitors from getting exemptions. Domestically, are tariffs for Trump just another tool to bind corporate wealth and power to the personal power of the unitary executive in an administration that's already formalized oligarchic rule to an unimaginably brazen degree? And how then does what we're seeing with Trump in the US, how does that compare, or what can we learn about it from looking at what we've seen with maybe Erdogan's Turkey, Putin's Russia, Modi's India?
Yeah, it's actually been a really interesting sort of problem, which is he's frankly says, look, this is going to cause pain to workers. This is going to cause pain to farmers. This is going to cause, like, your prices are going to rise and jobs might go. But we are suffering or sacrificing for the nation, right? It's not even like said in there will be immediate gains. It's always short-term sacrifice for longer-term gains. And whether or not those longer-term gains materialize, is anyone's guess. But this question of, is he actually just creating sort of new instruments, exactly as you put it, to presidentialize the system and ignore Congress, right? Like trade is one of those objects that is very clearly put into Congress's hands. And by him sort of like taking over power from Congress and actually sort of putting this power in the hands of the executive does exactly what you said. It creates an American version of the license Raj, which was this sort of infamous system of permits of which companies get to make how much, and import quotas, export quotas in India. And I think this question of, does everybody just come to grovel to him, ask for that exemption? And then you basically create a new power system where you do favoritism towards a certain set of companies and you punish other sets of companies. And that basically ends up sort of imperializing the presidency or increasing the power of the presidency. And maybe that's the kind of project that he is engaged in. We've definitely seen, Modi in India do very similar things of just creating new instruments. It could be new tax laws or demonetization, getting rid of the currency, or, new tools that then increase the power of the party and increase the power of the president. And in my view, like that's definitely one really important sort of theory to watch, exactly as you put it, like increasing this sort of oligarchic nexus sitting around Trump and really changing the American political economy. And it's really interesting actually to watch Democratic politicians sort of say that out loud. Now, like somebody like Bernie Sanders will just say, look, I've been telling you about the oligarchy. This is what it like concretely means.
Yeah, just to add a short comment on this, I also think this is a very convincing theory. And it does resonate quite a bit with what we can see in countries like Turkey, Indonesia, and Singapore and others, where there's been as I mentioned earlier, an active remobilization of things like sovereign wealth funds and state-owned banks, state-owned enterprises, and so on. And this to achieve a range of geoeconomic, geopolitical goals. But often those state capitalist instruments, if we can call them like that, become tightly integrated into existing structures of power and become used as a tool to cement the rule of particular elites. We've also seen that, in Hungary and Poland, which have quite significantly recreated the state-owned banking sector, and which use state-supported, state-controlled venture capital funds. And again, this is to achieve political and economic objective, but there's also an important aspect to them, which is that they're tightly enmeshed into particular attempt at fostering specific types of political rule.
It's called the washing machine in India. You throw your political opponents into it and you churn, and you send the FBI after them, you send the taxman after them, you send the courts after them. It's called sort of lawfare in Brazil and Latin America. But it's essentially using instruments of state power to contain your political opponents, force them to submit to the will of the executive.
Does it have echoes of how China disciplines, say, Jack Ma?
Well, I mean, China also executes a lot of billionaires and a lot of corrupt politicians. So there's capital punishment, in both senses of the term.
Capital discipline and punishment.
Right.
We've talked a lot about how Trump is attacking the longtime bases for American imperial power abroad. But at home, Trump and Musk's Doge are gutting the sort of scientific research and broader administrative state functions that would ostensibly play a key role in this sort of state capitalist geopolitics, the kind of state that you would need, one would think, to effectively wage a new Cold War on China. There's been so much talk of a bipartisan convergence around industrial policy specifically to take on China in the United States, but the only industrial policy Trump seems willing to use in practice appears to be the indirect one of fighting trade wars through tariffs. What sort of state capitalist geopolitics can the state that Trump is making conduct, given that all he seems to be willing to use is tariffs, that he's gutting the administrative state, that his administration is guided not so much by the so-called national conservative Republicans who we used to hear a lot about, but really by a bunch of billionaires, by anarcho-capitalists and radical libertarians, and really, in the case of people like Musk, just by outright unhinged freaks, people we really maybe shouldn't try to confer too much ideological coherence to, and who are really burning it all down for reasons that require as much psychoanalytic analysis as political economic analysis.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And this is where the kind of being attentive to agency and open-endedness is quite important, as Tim also mentioned earlier. So, if you accept the argument that I laid out earlier, that there's now a new set of structures due to the network structure of the world economy and a new form of geopolitics, which has emerged out of that. This is not to say that, states and governments would just unproblematically use the tools that they need to then strategically intervene in this new form of geoeconomic and geopolitical competition. I mean, there might be some of that, but there might be a lot of waste and failure and all sorts of politics as well. So obviously one important aspect in relation to that is that this is happening within a particular institutional ideological environment which has been profoundly shaped by neoliberalism and the kind of morbid politics that it gave rise to. So we can't expect that states, whether they are in the US or wherever in the world, would just simply seize the opportunities of this kind of new structure of state capitalist geopolitics and would kind of consciously, rationally act in that to serve their purposes. I mean, there might be some of that. There might be some smart state capitalist geopolitics and some well-designed interventions and strategies and so on. But we also see a whole host of failed experiments and an attempt at doing something. I mean, a less dramatic example than Trump 2.0 is Macron, which is the French president, which in a lot of ways has been trying to do a lot of things in relation to, for instance, boosting the production of advanced semiconductors in France or investing in renewables and those kind of things. But despite the kind of discourses about that and perhaps efforts, even if we accept that those efforts were honest, there's been all sorts of obstacles. For instance, when a plan was put in place to indeed boost the production of semiconductors by attracting world leaders in semiconductor production and by using a form of industrial policy and state subsidies to bring that home in France. In fact, what happened was that the institutional capacities to carry this out had just been completely hollowed out by state restructuring over the previous couple decades, neoliberalism and so on. So, these new forms of politics are happening within that context, which have been deeply shaped by those ideologies and institutions of neoliberalism. And I think that matters quite a bit to understand some of the hesitancies, failures, improvisation and all those things really at the moment.
Yeah, the thing that I just add, like this hollowing out of state capacity under neoliberalism that Ilias is sort of talking about is sort of like deliberately gutting the administrative state and so on. And you have this kind of cycle in at least the US where Democrats will try and rebuild state capacity and hire, thousands of IRS agents and thousands of people at the Department of Energy and staff and, Veterans Aid and so on and so on. And when Republicans come into power, they sort of reduce the size of that, of the bureaucratic state. If you're a sophisticated kind of state capitalist and a sophisticated kind of liberal that wants free markets and capitalism to grow and your wealth and prosperity to grow, you sort of want a superintendent and a bureaucracy and an administration because modern societies are just complex and they require rules and regulations and administration for the smooth functioning of global capitalism, right? Like this is the kind of the standard picture. And what you're seeing is a bunch of, libertarians take over the state, and they don't really have any theory of the state. They don't actually have a sense of what the state might be useful for in the way that, previous generations of Republicans may have had. And in that sense, they might just be creating such a level of volatility and chaos and disruption that they end up sort of harming their own interests. And this is something that I guess the Marxists and the left would point to. This is just a very clear sort of contradiction in capitalism, but it is also just extraordinarily disruptive to people's lives, right? Like, if there aren't any firefighters, who's going to put out the fires? If there aren't any people, sort of epidemiologists or food inspectors, like, millions of people could die if, I don't know, sewage gets into the water system and nobody's looking at, the H5N1 sort of flu that's going around. And there's just no people to deal with safety at all. And planes fall out of the sky, the entire sort of commercial airline business might go bankrupt and so on. So there's this very weird sort of nihilist sort of logic to what they're up to, which doesn't really make any sense if you just believe in some level of capitalist rationality. And I think that's why so many of us are just sort of struggling to not just make sense of it, but like live through this. Like, I don't know, I feel like I can't go to the supermarket and get meat or fly more than like once a year, because who knows if it lands upside down.
I mean, the possibility and even plausibility of a bird flu pandemic with RFK and Dr. Oz at the helm. Imagine the press conferences. Yeah. Imagine what that will feel like locked in our homes. Jesus Christ.
I mean, and there's an element of me that says, in when you're in the trenches, like, no one is an atheist, right? And maybe, exactly what RFK was like, okay, people, I need you to get a measles vaccine in Texas, once there is a serious measles outbreak that starts killing children. And you're like, they will be forced to realize that there's a level of rationality to the way we have organized complex social life.
I read an article in the FT yesterday just speaking to how this is affecting really the geoeconomic instruments of war that the Biden administration invested so much in developing. This former Morgan Stanley investment banker, Michael Grimes, who's being sent into the CHIPS program office at Commerce to weed out and fire undesirable employees. And they're going around asking people questions like, what's 4 to the 4th power? Like someone who knows a lot about one thing, i.e. making a lot of money on Wall Street, but is actually an absolute idiot in terms of how to run the state.
And you just kind of have to contrast this. Like, we really need to pull back to the global picture again, just like you have to contrast it to extremely sophisticated East Asian bureaucracies, which is sort of like the deep lore of East Asia is, meritocratic, like bureaucratic establishment that, takes the best and the brightest and plunks them into the state and not puts them as a merchant into as a market, right? Like, and you're like, okay, we are up against that. And it is, I mean, it's comical, but just like extraordinarily disastrous to just think about how do you run this, sorry, what was it again? Geopolitical state capitalism with no state.
I said in the last episode I did with the hosts of TrueAnon that if Elon Musk is the Xi Jinping of the United States is absolutely fucked.
Yeah, well, it's this move fast, break things mentality. It turns out it's not so great for strategic planning and those things.
We touched on this a bit earlier, but what are the more general economic dynamics or problems that are driving this broader turn among states toward interventionist economic policy? Is this just about the rise of new centers of economic power, namely China? Is it about certain sorts of economic limits being met, contradictions emerging in advanced capitalist economies? Is it related to the centrality of assets from real estate to cryptocurrencies or financialization more generally? What's going on? Is the politics of all this rather contingent or is it rooted in some fundamental economic issues pervasive throughout the capitalist world system? And And I think you two, from our discussions prior to this interview, you might have somewhat different assessments here.
We might, yeah. I mean, I would be tempted to emphasize the more structural aspect of it also, arguing that the various forms of state power that we're seeing are deeply rooted in secular developments in global capitalism, including questions of economic stagnation or secular stagnation, as some economists call it. So the idea that the world economy as a whole has entered a period where it's hard for global capitalism to sustain rates of growth that would be considered healthy, so to speak. And that manifests as low economic growth rates on average, low labor productivity gains, low levels of investment in manufacturing, and so on and so forth. And of course, you could say, as a result of that, if the economic pie is not growing as fast as it used to, then competition over this pie is becoming more intense. And that means that capitalist firms, especially in the sectors which are most affected by those questions of stagnation, competition in those sectors become more and more intense. Firms compete over trade, investment, and market opportunities even more. This economic competition translates into political pressure, and that becomes a question of geo-economic imperative for states. So there's this compulsion on the part of states to intervene more as a result of this. Likewise, and as you said, financialization, I think, is an important transformation as well here, insofar as it's contributed to the network nature of the global economy that we've discussed earlier, but it's also created all sorts of crises and instabilities in global capitalism that require some sort of management. And this too is pushing states to do more and more. There's also all sorts of political and economic conflicts domestically. It's become harder and harder for states to manage class relations, you could say, in Marxist terms, to contain social antagonism. All those questions become harder in context of low growth, basically. Not to attribute everything to the question of economic growth, but that does matter quite significantly in material terms for the purpose of containing antagonism within capitalist societies. And finally, you could say that the climate transition and the kind of technological developments associated with that are also moving or kind of shaking things up. And this too is kind of pushing states to intervene more if they want to be part of this race. So that includes things like clean tech and renewable energies, but other things as well. And more generally speaking, it has appeared increasingly clearly to both states and firms alike that the range of technologies which are at the cutting edge of the productivity frontiers, so things like advanced semiconductors, robotics, AI, quantum computing, advanced materials, biotech, and so on. All those things are general purpose technologies, which is that if you're missing out on those, you're likely to be completely out of the competitive race. And so this too is pushing states to intervene more in the form of techno-industrial policy, tax credits, subsidies, and all those kind of things. This more applies more to of course technologically advanced richer countries in the West and in East Asia, but developing countries too, as a result of the ongoing crises and contradictions of global capitalism, have been pushed to intervene more extensively to manage all sorts of problems, to also invest in infrastructure as a means to try and facilitate the integration of their economy within global supply chains to then foster development and industrialization. And this too becomes increasingly important for the question of the green transition. So yeah, I would be tempted to emphasize a lot more the kind of structural aspects of it all, and again rooting those new forms of state power and state capitalist geopolitics within the long historical development of global capitalism.
I think maybe the reason we disagree is perhaps because I'm now paying a little bit more attention to the geopolitics of it and not the economic bases of it, right? And geopolitics requires people in charge of states to do certain things with that power with a view to maximizing their future power and wealth. And this is if you just buy that kind of state mercantilist kind of turn, the neo-mercantilist turn, as where we are. And so if you just think about what do state elites do to give themselves a level of autonomy and conduct their political projects, right? And you could think of three people in particular. You could think about what Netanyahu is up to, what Putin is up to, what somebody like Modi is up to. Like these people are willing to get rich using free trade and liberal integration into world markets. So, Russia sells its foods, fertilizers, hydrocarbons. It's not an autarkic state looking inward. It is actually going out, getting power and wealth, using that power and wealth to accumulate a lot of dollars, and then giving the state elite some autonomy to carry out power political projects. In the case of Russia, it says, we are going to invade a sovereign country because we feel threatened by Ukraine getting richer or getting more support of the West or getting a stronger army, etc. In the case of Netanyahu, Israel uses its technological might and looks east and markets to China and markets to India, etc., so that if in the future the West tries to contain it with sanctions, it will remain relatively impervious to them. And somebody like Modi will be, increasing a lot of his dollar war chest by selling more and more technological services to the West. But then the pursuit of power domestically in their economies, in the case of Modi, or externally in the case of Netanyahu and Putin, it just seems to have a lot of agency there. I don't see, the falling rates of profits or structural stagnation or blah, 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 actually sort of paying too much force in what they decide to do. And that's perhaps why I feel sort of the economistic arguments seem unconvincing to me, because at the end of the day, some sets of elites have to do something with the power that they have accumulated economically, and what they choose to do seems kind of like just a function of how they see their political project going ahead.
The point is not quite to say that all of the decisions and actions of those state leaders are determined by the sort of deep forces and trends that I've talked about. Nor is it to say that they make their own decisions based on or in reaction to those forces, right? But it's to say that there's potentially consequential trends, economic trends, material trends that operate behind their backs, to put it in someone else's words, and that those are important to understand the particular form that those actions are taking. So it's no coincidence that we've seen, I think, over the past 20 years or so, the emergence of state, increasing use of state capitalist instruments, and those I don't think we can explain those trends without any sort of theory about the historical development of capitalism as a system, and the kind of ideological changes that come with that, right? So the reason why we've been talking a lot as of late about the death or non-death of neoliberalism, or the death or non-death of the liberal international order, I mean, those are sort of ideational changes which are rooted in those kind of deeper transformations that I talked about earlier. I don't think we would talk about those if those other structural developments weren't at play.
Yeah, and I'll just say, there is an element of interaction here. So if one person starts to do it, then because you live in a world of interstate competition, you then have to do it as well, right? So for example, if Putin launches a war of aggression on Ukraine, then the rest of Europe has to then use its money to raise an army or invest in its military to defend itself and so on. So there's this level of interaction where it's just kind of inescapable that, we've just lived in a world of sort of interstate armed competition for at least 500 years or 200 years or whenever you want to date this. And when you have that interacting interstate system of aggression, then it's just like you have to do it because the other fellow is doing it.
That was the first episode of a two-part series with Ilias Alami and Tim Sahay. Tim Sahay is the co-editor with Kate McKenzie of The Polycrisis, a publication at Phenomenal World that focuses on the political economy of climate with an emphasis on the global south. He's also the co-director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University. At the lab, he advises governments from Lula's Brazil to Claudia Sheinbaum's Mexico on finding their slice of jobs, profits, and investments in the highly contested global green economy. Ilias Alami is a professor in political economy at the University of Cambridge and a research associate at the Second Cold War Observatory. He's the author of Money, Power, and Financial Capital in Emerging Markets, and the co-author with Adam Dixon of The Specter of State Capitalism, which is free to download. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting, the bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. By industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theoria Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please also rate and review us super positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really and truly does that is you telling other people that you know, IRL, online, wherever, to check out this pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and going strong. Even a few bucks is huge.